This video is about Kimberly Crenshaw's seminal thinking around intersectionality. Crenshaw was actually the person who created the term intersectionality that we use today to describe the experiences and the theoretical contemplation of issues where a single person experiences multiple axes of simultaneous and interacting oppressions. Crenshaw wrote Demarginalising the Intersection of Race and Sex, about black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory and anti-racist politics in 1989. It was a groundbreaking work that looked specifically at the role of multiple oppressions, and it was looking in particular at the experiences of black women in the US. But the theoretical thinking behind it is somewhat more universal. She used a really useful metaphor, and this is where the term intersectionality comes from. She said that for the thinking in anti-discrimination law in the US at the time, it treated oppression like a single car accident. Someone was at fault, that was the discriminator. Someone was a victim, the person who had been discriminated against. There had to be a clear line from discriminator toward discriminating against the victim of the discrimination. This was easy to find in situations where there was a single form of discrimination in play. So like a person crossing a road who was hit by a car coming from only one direction, it was easy to see who was in the wrong. But then she looks at a range of different cases that had occurred in the US to look at the issue of what happens where it's not so clean cut. What if the oppression against someone isn't only because they're black or only because they're a woman, but had specifically arisen because the person discriminated against is a black woman? She gives it an example of a case which involved discrimination in a factory setting. And in that factory, there were two groups of workers. There were the factory workers on the floor of the factory who were predominantly male. And there were the office workers who were predominantly female. The factory and the economy had a bit of a downturn, so they decided to put off workers on a seniority basis. Those who were the last to be hired were the first to be fired. The problem, however, came because that overwhelmingly impacted a group of black female workers. They had been the last to be hired and they were the first to be fired. They sued the factory. But the problem was they were suing and saying, we've been discriminated against as black women and we are being fired as a group because we were the last hired. We were the last hired because the hiring practices of this factory meant that black women were the last group to generally be hired. The court looked at this and they said, so you're saying that you're discriminated against because you're women and you're discriminated against because you're black. Let's have a look at that. And they looked at the whole of the workforce and they said, well, no, they've been hiring black men in the factory for a long time. Those black men are not being fired. Therefore, you're not being fired because you're black. At the same time, they've been hiring women in the office for a long time. And yes, they're predominantly white women, but the women in the office, the other women workers of this company, are not being fired. So you're not being fired because you're a woman. The issue had arisen that for a very long time, while only women were hired for the office, there was a practice of not hiring black people for the office. That meant that black women were not being hired while black men were being hired for the factory and women were being hired for the office. Black women were specifically not hired by this company and were the first to be fired because they were the last to be hired. The court said, however, well, no, actually you're not being discriminated against because you're A, a woman, or B, black. They have other workers they are not discriminating against who are women and who are black. They didn't look at the intersectional issue, which was that women had been hired in the office, fine, but not on the factory floor. That was discriminatory to start with. And then only white women were hired in the office. So the category of women who could be hired was based on race. But because that was both gender and race in play, the court could not conceptualise that or refuse to conceptualise that as either a racial or a gender issue. They would have been discriminated against for their gender in trying to get a job on the factory and for their race in trying to get a job in the office. But because both issues led to the discrimination, that meant that in the court's eyes, there was not sufficient discrimination to meet the statutory requirements. And that's where Crenshaw was saying, well, what happens if someone is, in her analogy, hit by cars at an intersection? You've got a crossroad. Two cars come and hit someone at the same time from two cross streets, race and gender, acting as simultaneous sources of oppression. And what if the injuries caused are exacerbated or caused by the fact that two cars impacted the person at once? And you can't say that car caused that injury, that car caused that injury, or that the injury is more serious because there were two cars. And that's why she's talking about intersectionality. It's situations where you can't pull out either just one axis of oppression or where two axes of oppression operate together to cause a greater injury, or a more specific and differently constructed injury to that which would be caused purely on the basis of race or purely on the basis of gender. There's some quotes here in the next few slides. For those of you who are listening to this rather than looking at it, I will read them out. If you prefer to just skip and look at them, that's fine too. At page 140 of our article, Crenshaw said that with black women as the starting point, it becomes more apparent how dominant conceptions of discrimination condition us to think about subordination as a disadvantage occurring along a single categorical axis. I, that is Crenshaw, want to suggest further that this single axis framework erases black women in the conceptualisation, identification and remediation of race and sex discrimination by limiting inquiry to the experiences of otherwise privileged members of the group. In other words, in race discrimination cases, discrimination tends to be viewed in terms of sex or class privileged blacks. In sex discrimination case, the focus is on race and class privileged women. So what she's looking at there is that it's easier to show for a black man, so a sex advantaged person, particularly a black man of upper or middle class, to show discrimination against comparators. And simultaneously, for women, it's often white women who are the standard, and whether or not they are disadvantaged compared to their black sisters will not be looked at as a question. Rather, it will be looked at, do women as a monolithic class, dominated by white women, show disadvantage against a similar normative class, usually of class privileged white men? She went on at page 152. In so much of feminist theory, and to some extent in anti-racist politics, this framework is reflected in the belief that sexism or racism can be meaningfully discussed without paying attention to the lives of those other than the race, gender or class privileged. As a result, both feminist theory and anti-racist politics have been organised in part around the equation of racism with what happens to black middle class or to black men, and the equation of sexism with what happens to white women. And so the early analyses, the analyses of women like Betty Friedan, who looked at the problem with no name of women in the US, was really talking about the problem with no name of middle and upper class white women who did not work outside the home and who fit the normative prescription that white women must stay within a private sphere. That private sphere was not as accessible to women of colour in most Western countries. They were often forced into servitude or alternatively forced into paid labour through class-based oppression, which required them to work outside the home to allow a family to have enough to live, or through a whole range of other oppressions, which meant that in some communities, black women may have more access to work, such as being a household servant, than black men may have, particularly in the US in parts where black men were often refused entry to factory jobs, etc., while their female partners or their sisters or mothers could access domestic servitude work. She went on at page 155. The critique of how separate spheres ideology shapes and limits women's roles in the home and in public life is a central theme in feminist legal thought, and it certainly was in the late 80s and early 90s when Crenshaw was writing. But this observation overlooks the anomalies created by cross-currents of racism and sexism. Black men and women live in a society that creates sex-based norms and expectations, which racism operates simultaneously to deny. Black men are not viewed as powerful, she said, nor are black women seen as passive. And you only have to look today at the pernicious stereotyping of black men as physically aggressive, or black women as the sassy matriarch of a family. Stereotypes which, while a few people may fit them, the vast majority of people don't. And that then leads to unique forms of oppression experienced by black men as being not socially powerful other than as being physically aggressive and therefore less intelligent, less capable, and black women being seen as less easy to harm because of this powerful, stoic position attributed to them in society. And there are also some really ugly sexualisation around women of colour's bodies, as many of you who are women of colour may have noticed. Crenshaw goes on to look at how anti-discrimination legislation related to black women discriminated against as black women rather than only as being African Americans or only as being women in the sorts of cases that I just talked about. She also mentioned some other cases where black women had sued and they were told they were inappropriate plaintiffs in class actions or in representative actions because they could not represent all women. So their experiences were not representative of their white female co-workers or all people of colour, so that they were not representative of the experience of their black male co-workers. So they were seen as anomalous, even though they shared oppressions, and their oppressions were often doubled because of their multiple axes of oppression. She looked, as I've covered, at discourses around women in the private sphere and how that harms black women in particular in the US, partially because many have been forced out of the private sphere, and then their femininity and their ability to found a family were harmed by discourses which made them anomalous or constructed them as unusual and unfeminine. She looks at discourses of women in work, and similarly that their work and their ability to work is multiply affected by their oppressions. She looks at discourses of sexuality and rape law, and I will give you a big heads up on this one if you're reading the article, in that she does look at some really ugly early comments in some cases around women of colour in the US and how they were constructed as automatically sexualised and unchaste, and therefore it was extraordinarily difficult and still is today in many cases, to secure convictions of white men who had raped black women, and a simultaneous tension against black men where allegations of rape may be used to cause the death by lynching or imprisonment of black men, some of whom may not have committed the rapes alleged. She also looks at disempowerment of men of colour and resulting discourses of power about women of colour, and how men of colour are constructed as unnecessary sometimes in their communities by commentators outside their communities, or as feckless or uncaring for their families, etc. And looks at how ideologies around class, welfare payment, race and family formation, particularly in the late 80s under the rise of the welfare queen mythology under the Reagan government, was particularly impacting black women and black men in the US society, and how those things were specifically focused around constructions of them not as women with children to care for and thereby needing welfare payments, or just as black people, but rather as black women who were rorting a system through giving birth to children, how black men were simultaneously being constructed as reckless or uncaring because the society would pay welfare payments, and how black women in particular, were being seen as benefiting or profiting from welfare, and that was a particular discourse which was increasingly important to politics at the time Crenshaw was writing. So her article unpacked a lot of this stuff and made explicit the way that race and gender could simultaneously be deployed to create a particularly gendered and raced, or simultaneously raced and gendered identity of the black woman, which is quite separate from the way that society would create the identity of woman or a black person. And she unpacks that and challenges feminism to do better and anti-racist workers and theorists to do better. So it was a very, very powerful article and very important in the history of intersectionalism, and in fact gave that idea of intersectionalism its name and its conceptual framework.